All you, buddy.
Thanks, man.
All right, bye.
Cool. All right, you ready to rock and roll, man? As ready as you can be? All right. Hey guys, welcome to this month's Fix My Hog event. I'm Tommy Creel, contributing editor to Fix My Hog. And today we're going to be rolling through this CVO Softail Harley we have here and going through some of the components that you should check on pre-rides. And then also I'm going to dive into broadly just some of the components that you should be checking throughout your time on the bike. So whether you're going for a long ride or you're going up to Sturgis, down to Florida, wherever you may be going, those components we're going to take a look at and give you kind of a shortcut of what to look for. Before we jump into things, make sure below that chat box you hit that free download for the troubleshooting with the Harley codes there. That's free video, great little tips and tricks in there. So make sure you download that and check it out. And then throughout this time, for you newcomers, I got my chat box rolling over there for you guys. So if you got any questions or you want to see a demonstration or something, we'll make it totally interactive with you guys and drop your question in there. Or if you want me to cover something again, we'll kind of roll with it there. So make sure you get involved in that chat box. I'm going to be checking it frequently over here, and we'll get rolling from there. So additionally, make sure throughout your time riding and no matter if you've got a new bike or a previously used bike, you're sharing it with us. Hashtag share FMH. So hashtag share FMH on Instagram. Make sure you're sharing it with us. We'll get it out there as best we can and get you some exposure on it. So thanks again for joining us, and we're gonna dive right into this. Hopefully Zach's on the Zoom game today because we're gonna be going into a lot of the fasteners, some of the bezels. We're gonna go into our interfering here. I'm starting to look at what could get loose in that predicament there. But chose this bike because there's a lot of aftermarket components on here nowadays. Obviously, with our street glides and road glides, twin cams in general, we're doing a lot of making up. So buying it stock and throwing either a lot of chrome on or flat black and go in those directions. So when doing that, you got to take some time and make sure those new fasteners, those new nuts, and those new seals are seated correctly over some time with the bike. So that's why we kind of got this bike up here on the lift to show you guys, and obviously still referencing some good stock components on your bike as well. So not too much to change in there. So top 10 things I would suggest to look at for pre-rides, and if you need me to slow down, drop it in there, but I'll cover it again at the end. Top 10, I'm suggesting you guys take a look at all your fluids. So take a look at your oil, take a look at your brake reservoir, how much brake fluid you have in there, go all the way down and just go front to back on all your fluids. Additionally, obviously, our tires, our rims. If you're running spokes, you're going to want to take a look and make sure those spokes are tightened up, they're not loose, and they're not bent. And also the tire pressure, obviously, is going to be a big deal with weather changing and all that. And for you guys on the West Coast or East Coast and the Midwest, we're going through a little cold drought right now, so your air pressure is going to be fluctuating. So make sure you check that as well. And not over tightening spokes. So additionally, fasteners. Now this could be a much more lengthy endeavor than going right through and checking your tread depth right on your your tires or your pressure. I would highly suggest after 500 miles, 2,500 miles, 5,000 miles, 10,000, you kind of clean sweep your bike on and checking all fasteners, make sure they're still seated. They're still holding in the position you want them to, and even on your pre-ride, that's you can kind of take a look and use the chat box, not the phone line. So kind of run through that and make sure those are all seated and properly seated. Air intake bolts has been a big one. You'll see numerous times. There's probably some funny videos out there, but Time and time again, those nuts or those bolts will back out on your intake, and if you have an aftermarket one, this is a really big deal to double check those. Excuse me. So kind of take a look at the air intake bolts, make sure they're seated correctly. If you have countersunk bolts, make sure those are all the way seated correctly in that outer portion, and you won't know till that sucker is gone and down the road if it was on tight. So double check that, and it's easy to do. It's quick. I know you're jonesing, get on the road, get rocking and rolling, but take a minute and kind of go through these. The number 5 would be the license plate bolts. Now this could be just stupid or kind of out of the blue, but those are a big deal. Obviously you don't want to lose that sucker down a trip, but it's very easy. Make sure those 4 bolts are seated. If you have reflectors or lights on there, or any of those aftermarket components, double check that those are seated all the way in as well. And you're ensuring that you're not going to be losing a license plate on short or long run that you have there. Additionally, and I'm going to slow down here in a few minutes and give myself a break from talking, but battery terminal. Make sure those bolts are nice and snug up on here. If they're a little bit loose, you're going to cause some arcing. And what's going to happen with that throughout a small period of time is actually you're going to lose power and draw those amps and at a severely high rate, rather than having that battery recharge. So you're actually draining your battery if those are pulled off a little bit. This is something simple to do. I'd highly suggest using a socket rather than using the Phillips. Yeah, it's tempting to just put your Phillips right in there and crank on it, but you're going to strip that material out pretty quickly. These aren't chromoly or hardened steel type of bolts. So take a look at this, and even the terminals around the battery as well. This one, we had redone the entire front end with new gauges, stereo system, and all the bells and whistles, and had to hook up a couple additional wires for those batteries and gauges. So we obviously having this bike in, double checking all these to make sure they're properly seated, not interfering with the seat as well, and the fuses. Those are going to be either on your left or right side on road glides or street glides. Make sure those are all the way seated as well. So I'll go a little bit more in depth on this later on, but for a pre-ride, that's what you're going to want to take a look at, is just making sure everything's secure in there. And then moving on, handlebar bushings and switch housing. Those two are the other major areas to look at. Now, obviously, it would totally suck to be jonesing down the road and all of a sudden your switch housing starts moving up and down, which has happened time to time with bikes we've had in. And these 2 little bolts, one on the top, one on the bottom here, have the tendency to back out time to time. These are typically button heads or Allens on different manufacturers. But take a look at these. And what can happen after not only just having this loosened up is that those wires, if they're internally run or externally run, they're both going to be starting to shear off and split and splice a little bit. And obviously for the sake of keeping your brain intact and not losing your stuff, your marbles, we want to make sure those don't have any interference with the bike. So that'd be a costly and long-term fix, and easily avoidable at the same time too. So make sure these switch housings are nice and tight, and that you're also not binding up on those wires. It can be easily done. I've done it time and time and caught myself because you're not slipping them directly under that dimple that allows you to get it through without splicing it. So take another look. It's, as you've seen in many of our videos here on Fix My Hog, we preach about working safe and a clean working environment, but also double and triple checking your work as well. So this would be something to double and triple check. And then handlebar bushings. This can be, I don't have the right word for you, but this we can overlook this one pretty easily. Handlebar bushings are going to be obviously going through our top triple tree right there, and those are made out of polyurethane. And what those actually do is help us prevent a more rigid ride on our handlebars. So if you're running ape hangers or drag bars, those are going to prevent a little bit of play, or those are going to allow us a little bit of play for a smoother ride. So you're not jamming down the road with your shoulders locked up and continuing to just put you back into stress and need to attend to that later on. So double check those, make sure they're not cracking. Just pull the chrome covers off of them and make sure the bolts seated as well going up to the handlebars, and you'll be good to go on there. So that would be another item if you have the accessibility to look at before your pre-ride. Take a look at those handlebar bushings as well. If you're down there and looking at that area, I would suggest looking at that top riser clamp or triple tree clamp you have right there, holding your bars down. Those, time and time again, you can see loosen up on this bike specifically, and other baggers as well. The amount of stress you're putting on those bars, whether you're pushing it up a hill, pushing it, just directly down a road that's flat, you're still applying pressure and trying to move those bars. So that top riser can lose some of that strength up there in those 4 bolts, or whatever pattern you may have, can actually start backing out a little bit. So that would probably be the last thing you want, is to be down the road again and have that happen. So if you're there, double check it, and if you pull those out, make sure you're applying Threadlocker as well, which I'll get to the different Threadlockers and purposes later on, but you're going to want to redo that. And then the 2 other things for that top 10 countdown for us here would be some of the cosmetic components, or bigger components like our levers, our running boards. As you can see down here, we have these slick little Ness running boards and the lever. Make sure those are all buttoned up and tightened up. Those bottom bolts right there have those nylocks on them. Those can back out pretty easily. So again, you wouldn't want to lose a $500, $600 piece of chrome down the road just because you didn't check it. And then lastly would be the motor mounts, depending on the year and model that you have. Double check and make sure those are all tightened up. Take just a wrench, try putting some pressure on it, and getting that thing, make sure those bolts are all tightened up. And you should be good to go. So refreshing, give myself a little break here. Top 10 list. We're going to check out the fluids. Make sure we've got at least semi-fresh fluids in there that are all topped out and still looking fine and not contaminated. We're going to go through and we're going to check out the tires, the rims, make sure the tire pressure is on point. And from there, we're going to move on to our air intake bolts. And yes, it sounds stupid, but like I said, stupid simple. Some of the stuff we just want to double check. So air intake bolts, license plate bolts while we're at it too. And then we're going to move into the battery section right here, and seat mounting bolts as well. Switch housings, switches, handlebar bushings, top risers, and floorboards. So holy cow, that's a lot of information for you right there. Hopefully you got some of that. Again, if you got questions on that quote-unquote top 10 pre-ride checklist there, please let me know. And obviously, depending on your bike and what you have, that can vary on some of the things. But what we're trying to get across here is that with the pre-ride, you don't want to take 2 hours and go through your entire bike and make sure, okay, this chrome cover for my ignition coil is tight, that bolt on the back is tight. And going through everything. Make sure the bigger components are buttoned up and nothing might have happened to those. You'd be amazed at what potholes can do to your bike, not only damage it, but it can pop a fastener out pretty quick. It can loosen or bend stuff. So that road can really, even though you're gripping and ripping it, can take control of your bike and some of that. So just take your time and look at the bigger components front to back. And at that point, once you get that stuff done, you're feeling comfortable with it, jump on your hog and rip it and have a safe ride. So again, any questions on that? I'm going to check the chat box here, see if you guys are tossing anything just yet. And then I'm going to start, all right, thanks Dennis. I'm going to start from the front, and again, if you have any questions, put it in there. But I'm going to broadly kind of go through some of this and what we're looking at and what to look for. All right, my cameraman, how you feeling? Can we see this over here? All right. So starting with our big wheel up here, So some of the things, if we have this thing in after 5,000 miles, we're going to take this kind of approach and look through things. So if you got miles on your bike, I would take this into consideration too. Clean sweep it like we're going to be doing here. What we had done on this bike is we had put the fork boots, whole new front end. Like I said, this was a CVO, so this whole entire Street Glide front end was replicated on here with a new neck. So these fork boots and these fork boots in the legs. We're going to check inside here on our fender mounts. A lot of you guys I've seen are tossing new fenders on, wraparounds, and snugging those up to the big wheels or even stock wheels. And inside here, can be a critical point because the aluminum billet that you're using on your fork legs here can actually, I'm sure by experience with some of you guys, can actually shear out and cross thread pretty quickly, and obviously losing a lot of tension and strength in there. So we're going to double check, make sure these are tightened up with a 1/2 inch wrench right here. These are going directly into our leg. And for the detail-oriented mechanics and fixer-uppers like you guys, what we've done in a lot of our painted components is that we'll always put a flat washer against the painted part of that area. So this fender bracket that was fabricated, we put that chrome washer there. And the reason being is that when we're applying pressure, and same thing when we're riding, we're not going to see that paint peeling off. It's kind of a semi half-ass paint preventative of that happening. So that's why you see these things here. And what I typically do is I'll run my finger and see if I could spin a washer or two, and if I can't, that'll be snug, but we'll double check the backs here. Again, on here, we're double checking the actual fender to the mount and making sure those are secure as well. Now, what you can't see on that side, but we'll get to it on the back, is the caliber. We've got 2 mounting bolts on the front end going to our fork leg down here. I don't know how skilled you are back there, buddy, but if you can see a finger or two right here. What we're going to be checking is actually that those are still snug up from this side. And from a quick glance on our rotor right here, we're going to make sure that the caliber is still centered out and those brake pads look to be at least even for the most part, and they're not wearing differently. Also, a little tidbit of information is that you can tell some of the wear patterns on your brake pads by looking at both sides of your rotor. Obviously not right after you ride because it's going to be hot, but let it cool down and you can see different wear patterns on the side. So brake caliber, check that out, make sure those 2 bolts are tightened in there. Take a peek at the pads, make sure they're both on the normal side of wear and tear, and also get into that fitting right here and make sure that's tightened up. And same thing with your bleeder. If you have put a new whole new lever on and reservoir for your master cylinder up there, you obviously had to rebleed your brakes and go through that component. So double check those. Not as likely, but have the tendency to time to back out. So you might be that one exception for not checking it that one time. Additionally, we've got a custom Kuryakin headlight trim right here. So we're going to double check and make sure the bottom clamp is snug up. Always just pushing against the headlight, make sure that's still seated. With this bike, what we would actually do is pull that trim off and make sure that seal behind there is still properly seated, just because of, obviously you're going to catch yourself in the rain one of these days. So making sure that seal is still properly seated in there as well. So make sure you check that headlight, no matter if it's mounted like this or externally mounted off the bottom of your triple tree, double check that. And also the wires too, if they're not hidden. Make sure those are still routed correctly and you're not going to be binding against those. We're going to be looking right here. This is our turn signal, smooth turn signal right here. But also behind here, road glides, street glides, street glides are going to have a similar setup. Your interfering mount is going right through here along with your interfering. So making sure whatever 2 types of bolts you have here, whether they be hex, countersunk, or button heads, those are securely pressed in. And if you have to, for any reason, take some of these bolts out and you see a blue marking on it. Obviously, many of you know that's a thread locker, blue thread locker, and that's blue is our go-to color on anything. So if you're pulling that bolt out, you see it. It will never hurt to put a dab of blue at the bottom of those threads when you put it back in. Just making sure we're being consistent all the way through. Additionally, what we're going to look at on the outer fairing is our seal right here. So, how are we looking, cameraman? Can you see this one? So our bottom seal right here is actually a little bit loose, and these are hot glued in on our end. So we're going to go through, pull the outer fairing off because we want to get in there and check everything internally. But what we're going to be doing is getting this seal properly seated again and remounting this outer fairing. So road glides and street glides, fellas and ladies, make sure you're double checking your seals. I can't stress enough how important those are, no matter if you're on a fairing, an intake, or whatever it may be, that those seals are correctly installed and still seated properly. So some of this may seem redundant, but I want to make sure you guys have the right information and the right direction to go to here. So bear with me on that. Some of these cosmetic components, believe it or not, have the tendency to back out as well. So we have a headlight trim right here that just went on the other side of our mounting bolts for our outer fairing, including our windshield. We're going to double check, make sure those guys are in. This windshield is still nice and snug up there and still seated correctly all the way down. Time and time I'll see those kind of pop out a little bit, which will lead me towards thinking that these bolts have backed out a little bit, and we will obviously pull those out, apply blue thread locker to it, and then put those right back in. So kind of looking on the outer shell, that's what we're going to be running through. If you got questions on that, drop it in there, that chat box. But to kind of recover, make sure we're checking our fender mounting bolts. Fork boots, those are kind of tough because you got to come in from the other side with those two bolts. But just make sure you got nothing leaking, your seals aren't leaking. Go through here, make sure our axle spacers are still intact. Brake caliper, that's still aligned. Brake pads are still looking good. Our rotor is still wearing properly. And then make your way to the headlight. Turn signals will be somewhere on this area, up or down, and your fairing end. So that's the start of it. Now what we have on this side, man, I really wish I could swing this. How you doing on that? You think you're doing it? All right, cool.
Teddy bear.
Elmer. All right, so what we've got, I'm going to actually jump on this side so they can see. Can you see this stuff? Can you see the instrumentals?
A little bit.
All right. So I'll do my best here, guys. But so when we're looking at kind of the console of our bike right here, we've got our obviously our radio, our deck, touchpad, whatever model or make it will vary. Instrumental gauges. In this instance, we have our speaker right here, and then also on the outside with our tweeters installed as well, and then our cover up down here under the fairing. Now, considering that this was something that was done aftermarket, and even with some of the stock applications, here's my suggestion to look at. Removing that outer fairing, as I mentioned earlier, what we're going to look at from the inside is that those brackets and seals are still properly seated on this inner fairing. Now, when we're putting these gauges into the inner fairing, we're putting the seal on and then dropping the gauge directly through. So it's going to be sitting on that outer bezel, which will likely going to be chrome, but making sure that's still tightened up with those nuts in the back, and also anything that you may have mounted up here. So the radio, make sure that bracket's still mounted properly. For us, one of the amps is mounted inside there, so we're going to double check, make sure that bracket is on as well. And then just double check to make sure there's no play. If there's a little bit of play in here, something probably came loose, but these are supposed to be pretty snug up. And additionally, making sure those speakers are in the same situation, that those are snug, the outside and the bracket for those as well, and the inner fairing are all snugged up as well. Now getting to the handlebars, and then we're going to get to everyone's favorite part of the bike, the wiring and the electrical side. Handlebars, what we want to look at is, I mentioned earlier, those bushings, to make sure those are, number one, still intact. That'd be a good thing if we still had those around. Also that those bolts going up to our risers or our connection point for our handlebars are still tightened up, and there's no play in there. And then also making sure our top clamp is properly seated. So typically 9 times out of 10, you're going to see 4 bolts holding that down with blue thread locker. Make sure those are properly seated. If you feel like you need to make an adjustment, do it then, and you'll be good to go. So double check those areas on your handlebars. And if you've run your electrical, actually, I'll get to that in a minute, but double check those areas. Also, our grips, those are internally connected right here on our housings. Make sure those are all the way seated. We still have play. The fly-by wires, obviously we want to make sure those are still engaged. That's a pretty easy thing to make sure of. Make sure it's still snapping and we're still getting some response to our throttle body or an induction down here. And like I said, the grips, just make sure those are properly seated. Now we're moving to the clutch lever or the master cylinder lever and mirrors and reservoirs up here. I always like to double check these pins. Now the pins dropping the lever through, you see that C or E clamp depending on who or what coast you're coming from, because I think everyone calls it different from the different coasts, but making sure that's still correctly seated in that beveled out area in there. I've seen those fly off time and time again after someone put one on, and all it takes is for that pin to start backing out a little bit, and all of a sudden it's all the way out. Your clutch lever's down the road, and you're running into stop traffic, and that's not where we want to be going. So double check that, and also our clamps right here on our lever, the 2 Torx right here. Make sure those are completely snugged down and flush with the handlebar and the top of our reservoirs. Now, we've had our share of struggle more recently with reservoirs leaking, and we were actually dealing with an aftermarket company. You remember this? Big time. And it came out to be a machining error, and about 3 or 4 of them we had to continue to go back. So what we saw is that after it built up pressure in the reservoir, we would get a small amount of leakage over time that pop out, and that time was frequently. We get it every 5-10 minutes. So double check to make sure you have nothing leaking. Leave it overnight, pump it a little bit, and make sure that's seated correctly after putting fluid in it. So that's a big thing. It's a headache. Yeah, I get it. And a lot of times it's either the seal is just not working with you that day, or you're fighting with your bike that day. So just take the time and try to take a deep breath and make sure that's properly seated and good to go. Mirrors are kind of self-explanatory. There's not too much to them unless you have them coming off the end of your bars. You have an external clamp coming off, many other variations, but typically you're going to see them coming right directly in here on our perch right here, and it's going to be one acorn nut on the bottom, flat washer, and then either a split washer or some other locking washer to hold that there. So double check that. That'd be a big bummer. Definitely if you invested in some sweet mirrors for your bike, to make sure those are secured down and good to go. And if you're changing out any fasteners, I know guys, some of my buddies that ride that will change out fasteners and make it look a little bit slicker. So for instance, they'll be putting chrome Allens in here, or chrome Allen bolts in here, and then putting a little copper button in there, make it look flush, or putting acorn nuts on things to make sure those are seated as well. So if you're kind of changing out fasteners, which more frequently, to make sure those are done as well. Man, that's a lot of talking. So on the housings and the switches, I want to cover that a little bit more. With the switches and the housings, a good idea to do with this is to actually turn your bike on and to go through we're going to go through and just make sure everything's working. And then high, low, left, right. Bad reception. And just making sure those buttons are freely working in there. They're not binding or kinking inside the housings. Sometimes when pulling those off, the buttons will just dislodge a little bit and catch an edge or get a bulk of the wiring behind it to push it out. So it's simple fixes 9 out of 10 times. So double check and make sure those housings are working properly. It's it can come down to, I've seen one time when I was in Sturgis where my bobber at the time, we had a little switch housing up there on the right side, and my kill switch got jammed up there and completely killed my bike out, directly running over to the rally. So make sure those things are free and moving over there. And then also, I mentioned a little bit earlier, those wires coming through. Now, when we're taking off our housings, and for say that you're putting on some slick aftermarket ones, and we pull those out and we let it drop, what actually happens is we're pulling that wire out a little bit. So I know we get jazzed up and stoked to put it back on real quick, but at the same time, we got to make sure and be cognizant that we need to put that wire back in there and make sure it's not binding or kinking. I can't tell you enough, and I know probably wiring and electrical is probably your favorite part of the bike altogether, but see, you're shaking your head. How much of a headache that can cause. A little 6-inch piece of 16 gauge wire will completely destroy a room. So imagine all the wires that we have going through here in the yards. And once those wires are all the way to, together, if you're looming them together, that will take an entire circuit or system all the way out. So be careful of that. And even our data bus wires that are running through our handlebars on all our bikes now, twin cam wise, those things burn up and you're running back here to your ECM and ECU unit to reprogram stuff, nonetheless, redo all the wiring. So be super, super cautious and about that area, and same thing coming out of the bottom of the bars. I was going to touch on this earlier, is that when we're routing those internal wires, now too, when we do bikes with internal brake lines, there's a lot of wires going through there. We want to make sure those don't bind or kink. So when you drop those out at the bottom of the bars and you're down there checking your handlebar bushings and your top clamp, make sure those are pushed off correctly and routed correctly. And what I mean by that is that when our turning radius of our front, we have either internal or external stops to make sure our front end doesn't completely turn 90 degrees and make us buckle like we're riding one of those rodeo things. So those stops actually stop it sooner to allow better turning radius and safety issues. But also it'll allow us to sneak some wires in. Now this one we actually just put the tank back on, so it's not as clean as I'd like it. But these wires we dropped out of here, and same thing here, and they actually go back up in here like this. So when we're turning our front end right here, we're not going to actually bind or kink these. So if it's sitting on the stand on the other side, and that wheel's all the way dropped to the left, that it's not going in and starting to rub against those wires. So it doesn't take much for a little smushing of a wire here or there to start a chain reaction with all that stuff. So take a peek at that, and I can't stress enough, make sure your wires are properly run and routed the correct way and out of sight. Obviously, if you can get them through the backbone or behind a shroud or something, that would be the best bet. So double check and make sure all these suckers are out of the way, and if you have a stock setup, even better. Harley's pretty good about having all that stuff already done. So, but those longer term rides, you never know what might be coming loose and getting out of the way. So double check that. All right, I need to check this chat box thing. Whew. You love your wires, don't you, Zach?
Oh yeah. They don't freak me out at all.
Cool. Sorry guys, I'm just Waiting for the good old computer to get caught up here. We got guest here. I got an '07 Fat Boy. I get rattling sound in 5th gear. That sounds like something coming from the drivetrain. Not sure if it's the compensator or the transmission. My recommendation. It's odd that you get in 5th gear. Then you might have some dog legs that have worn out, and definitely if you have miles on there, those shifter forks and those dog legs will wear out time to time. But what I'd suggest on that with an '07 Fat Boy, the less time-consuming thing to do is to actually just pull off that primary and take a peek to see if it is that compensator. Those have time to time. They can come loose, so make sure that nut is fully torqued down to spec. Take a look at the clutch basket as well. I don't know, I've seen weirder things that 4th or 5th gear, something will react differently. So take a peek at that and see if that or the chain is doing anything before you dive right into the transmission. You can just pull off that top drum cover, and from there, shift right through the gears, and you should be able to hear some kind of engagement of where it may be going wrong. So that's my recommendation. First take a peek and pull off that drive and run through that to see if anything's going haywire in there. Hopefully that helps. Hopefully that helps for you. I don't think I've done this much talking before in my life. All right. We're going to continue to pop on. We've been flying through time here, and I want to make sure we get this all in with you. So additionally, I'm going to jump on this side. Depending on the make and model, front motor mount, we want to double check that. Stabilizers, we want to go through and make sure those nuts are varying on where you have it adjusted. Those are all tightened down. Same thing with the actual mounts for themselves. This model, we're just going to double check to make sure that this air scoop is tight from the back, and then go through and check out our exhaust. Now, again, I'm going to reiterate, this is something that you can do after 5,000, 10,000 miles on your bike, is to take this big look in. It's not necessarily something you should do right out of the get-go unless you really like tooling around and tinkering on your ride. So suggestion obviously would be, we've talked about this, air intake, no matter if it's OEM or aftermarket, go through and make sure everything's tightened down on there. Obviously probably need a swap out that filter, clean it. So while you're in there, make sure everything's tightened down and looking good. Even go through and make sure your exhaust stud nuts right there are tightened down. Any brackets that you have with these guys, which we've got a torque clip back here that we'd want to make sure. Additionally, with our bracket going through our bottom of our down tube there. So make sure those are all tightened up. And most importantly, make sure those heat shields are tightened up as well. I know just like the terminals on the battery, it's easy to pull out a flathead and try doing that. You're going to strip it out. You're going to miss it potentially and start scraping that chrome. Get a socket, take the time to get a socket and go through and crank those down to make sure you have proper torque on those and those are suited well. Floorboards. Chatted about this one a little bit earlier. Make sure these guys are all the way tightened down. If you have bushings in there or some kind of rubber isolator in there, make sure those are tightened down. They're starting to come out with those now. That lever is our brake lever. Make sure this is all locked down, and same thing with our reservoir. So we'll be going through that and working our way backwards. Oil lines, another big area that we want to double check and make sure that if you have actual clamps on there requiring just like a heat shield clamp right here, make sure those are tightened down and there's not any play on that. Also make sure they're all the way pushed up on the fitting. If you find a loose one, make sure you loosen it up, re-put that on that fitting to make sure it's fully sealed, and then tighten it back down. So be amazed at how well these bikes can really cause us big time headaches if we don't take those kind of measures. So again, check those oil lines. You can check them for any kind of abrasions or cuts too, if you have like a stainless cover or a hose like this, and just run your finger through time and see if you have any leaks as well. Sensors, we want to take a look on those with our exhaust system. We're going to look at the front and the rear, make sure those are fully sealed still, and if they're not, obviously tighten those up, and then look at the connections for those as well. So go all the way back on street glides. It's going to be on your right side shroud. Make sure those are fully seated as well. Whew, man. So oil lines, temperature gauges, and then we actually have, just saw this with the swing arm, there's a cap that's pushed off right here, so we're going to have to double check that. Another thing, so it's time and time again with our swing arms on Softail models, what we have is we have a splash pan back here, then we have our pivot arm going through with 2 bolts and a combination of washers and bolts in there. And on the outside of those, if we don't have a fully seated bolt going into their swing arm here, we have a cover. This one's pinched, so I actually can't pull it out right now. But what we do with those is you will have an Allen that's a set screw to hold that in there on the outside, or outside of the actual cover that goes all the way through. But we also silicone them in there too to bring a second barrier for it to fall in off. So double check these if you do have a Softail model and make sure those are fully seated. Those little Allens just can be a pain in the rear half the time. So double check that as well. Rear floor pegs. If your old lady is out there cruising with you time after time, or whatever the scenario is, check those out and make sure those are still, obviously, number one, they're folding correctly and coming back in. Time and time again, you'll see that these will come loose if you're putting a lot of pressure on them. And just making sure there's no cracks or any stress fractures with those, and you'll be good to go on that side. Flanges aren't something that are the big things to come loose, but obviously it wouldn't hurt to run through these and look at them. And same thing with your rear fender bolts. Make sure those are all mounted still securely, and just give a good torque on these guys. Now, before I'm going to jump into the thread lockers here shortly, but make sure these are all using blue thread locker, and that's a must on those. Bikes with saddlebags, we want to make sure, obviously, number one, that it's mounted correctly and still not coming loose. This was actually a bike. The owner had issues coming out of a Harley dealership, and the bag came off because of the locking mechanism. And then, sure enough, once we got our hands onto it, it decided to re-erect and come back at it, and test drove it when the bike was done, and the bag flew off again. So those locking mechanisms in there, if it's even a click off, will disengage, and you'll be looking at a $1,000 redo on the leather and the Cayman. So double check those. Also the hinges, making sure those are looking pretty and nice still, and you'll be good to go. And then license plate bolts. That we covered that a little bit earlier, making sure these are still secure. Turn signals in the back, whether they're mounted externally or internally on a fender. Make sure those wires are still routed correctly, and that also those are still snug on those mounting points. Rear sissy bar and even the pill-on pad, make sure those again are mounted. And these pill-on pads, I haven't seen one personally come loose into our shop, but make sure that these are still snug again, and that our mounting brackets down here, and again with our polyurethane bushings down here, that it's still seated correctly. And you'll see some wear and tear on these polyurethane bushings after you've been out there riding for a few thousand miles on them and putting pressure against us. So it's nothing out of the norm, but something to just take a look at the same time too. So, and then seat mounting bolts. God, this is a pain. So a lot of times we'll have our street glides, road glides. You're going to have one mounting nut or bolt here in the back, and of course Harley is going to make it, so it's going to be the hardest nut and bolt to get to without having to try sticking an Allen down there and then potentially chipping the paint. I think they purposely have to put something in there, knock us off our rockers for a little bit. Make sure this thing is tightened, and this setup that we have is actually seat goes on, front two mounts are here, and then the back seat is one point here. But we actually had a customer last summer who came back around because he was riding and his pillon pad flew off because the bolt came loose, and his tang, which was holding it in, just disengaged and it flew off. So it's stupid stuff like that it seems to be super simple, and yeah, it's fine. That will cause that headache again. So hopefully you guys are getting that. A lot of these areas on the bike, it's very easy to go through and just check the fastener, even by the eye or touch, make sure things are tight, and go through that, because it can be a world of hurt on your pocket and also your time with riding that they're not checked. So keep an eye on that. And then before I jump into the thread locker, geez, we're scooting. Before I jump into the thread locker, we're going to go through under the seat here and what we have. So with this model, we've got our ECU. This is the motherboard of our bike. And then obviously all our looms of wiring coming back here to our connections, our fuse, our main fuse right here. This is the data bus that we'd put a tuner into back here. But making sure that all these are still properly routed the correct way. And all it takes is for one loom to pop up on top of this frame rail. That's why they have these as well, where these are actually metals, where the seat can sit down and not bind and kink these wires. Excuse me. But make sure those are all still in place. You can use a couple zip ties. You don't have to use a million zip ties to put the things down, but just to use a few to make sure they're still in place and that you don't bind and kink those. Eventually we should do a video on just showing them how to burn up a wire pretty quick, so at the end of it, it'd be a smoke show. But making sure these are all properly routed, and then the fuses are still properly seated in there, and also the ECM is mounted, and that the locking mechanism for your connection here is still seated correctly. And while you're down here, make sure all the bolts and some of these gas tank bolts are all nailed down and ready to ride another 5,000, 10,000 miles wherever you're at. But the last thing on this battery, I would double check and make sure that strap is properly still working on the top here. Pretty much 5 out of 10 bikes that we get in, we'll see those straps already undone, and those cushions are completely, those cushions are preventative to make sure that battery doesn't shake and rattle and lose its sturdiness, but those cushions will be completely nailed down and allowing for that battery to move a lot. So make sure you have some kind of wedge or something in there to make sure it's not wiggling and shaking around while you're rocking down the highway. And then these terminal nuts that we've already discussed a little bit here, make sure those are properly seated, those connectors are in place, and you should be good to go. I think that's a majority of the bike. Thanks for sticking with me with that long wind. On this side, obviously, I'm going to touch real quickly that you're not going to be able to see just yet, but the primary, you want to look at the derby cover. If you got an aftermarket derby cover on there, making sure the seal is still on there. And given this is an enclosed primary, wet primary, so making sure that derby cover and that seal are still working and sealed up, all the lubricants, making sure that outer cover is still intact. And then even one of the most overlooked items, I would say, is our actual kickstand. So we've had an instance where kickstands have come in and the spring is gone. And what that spring obviously does is it pulls the kickstand back to make sure it's dislodged and letting you ride. And if that spring is gone, that kickstand is going to come down, you drag on the right side, make a turn, it's going to buckle your bike. So I can't stress enough the safety side to this to making sure that everything is properly working in there. Put some anti-seize on it, grease it up, whatever you feel is suitable for your application, and make sure that is all properly working. And I know it's a pain in the ass to have that spring just get that in there and seat it correctly, but again, you're gonna avoid some major safety stuff and potentially some major damage to your bike if that thing's not done correctly. So take a minute, make sure that kickstand's still working, pins down, your white bushings are in there on both sides are still installed correctly. And then shifter linkage, you want to make sure that is still working properly. And those are all together, so holy cow. Thanks guys for sticking with me through that whole thing. I hope you guys find this beneficial because after you guys take rides and I'm on board with you, 5,000-10,000 miles, last thing you kind of want to do is really to take a whole run through your bike, but yet again, you never know what you're going to find, so make sure you take some time. Hopefully this was helpful and beneficial to get you from A to B or A to Z on what to check and some of the major things. And then if you're going to get a real big teardown over a winter month or something with you guys, make sure you're checking bushings, you're checking play and laterally and making sure you don't have too much. So that's a whole different conversation if you're going to go internal and make sure all that's going, but that's when you get up there to the 75, $100,000 mile markers up there, and same thing on the engine. So, all right, I promised you I'd cover those thread lockers, and we're going to get on to that real quick before we chew. All right, thread lockers. So I think people jump over this pretty quickly, but I get a few things out here for you. There's time and time again, I wish these things weren't magnetic bowls. I'm pulling up about half an army of nuts and bolts here for you guys. All right, so I'm going to cover two different things. One of the items that we have, obviously I've got a hex nut or a bolt right here, and then a flat washer, a split washer, and this one's probably a little bit better to see. Can you see this? And then just a regular nut, not a nylock, just a regular one. Now, the reason for using Loctite is to obviously hold that bolt into place. And that is usually in turn when you're not using a combination of split washers, nylocks, and flat washers. So if you have something similar to what we have here on the rear fender, where we have a through bolt going through and then a nut on the outer side, what we're going to do is actually use our bolt, and we're going to put a flat washer on this side, run it through, put a flat washer on again, and put that split washer on, and then our nut. Now what happens when these all work together is that the split washer, the reason why it's literally split, is it puts pressure against the actual nut and the flat washer, preventing it from backing out. Now, what I typically like to do and what we do at the shop is that we'll put a flat washer, a split washer, and then a nylock. And the nylocks you'll see with that clear coating on the outside, and that's another preventative. But that's the reason for having that, and I won't go too in depth because there's videos on this that you guys can check out too. But that's the reason for doing that. So if you're ever going to put split washers on and avoid the thread lockers, make sure you're doing a split washer and then a nylock as well. Now on some of these thread lockers, we have had our fair share of horror stories where we have green Loctite we've had in, and that was holding an axle nut on, and we actually had to bring out the oxyacetylene torches with a rosebud and heat it up, and eventually I think we had to cut it off. But there's four different types of thread lockers. So there's the green, which is Monster of the Midway green. You're never going to get that bolt or nut back off. You have red, which is going to use some kind of heat to get that back into a liquid form to allow you to pull the bolt out. You have the blue, which is our most go-to color, and then we have purple, which personally we don't even carry, and we don't carry green either. So you're going to typically use a blue or red. Now we've got two forms here. We've got the red liquid and then also the red paste. And it doesn't really matter what you're doing here, it's going to dry the same. But when you're applying the Threadlocker, here's the other kicker when you use the blue here. So when you're applying it, can you see this? You're just going to put it at the tip of the fastener right here. You're not going to run the entire length of the bolt and the nut down. And the reason being is that once you apply that Threadlocker right here and you start driving in that fastener, it's going to work its way through all these little grooves and make its way back, and then eventually, dry and secure the fastener all together. So if you're going from the head of the fastener all the way down to the bottom, that's pretty overkill. So don't stress about putting too little on. Just put some right here at the tip and take that route. So blue is going to be your go-to one. Red, we only use that really into some areas that we will likely not have to take off that component for a while, or we just frankly don't want that to come loose. So a swing arm pivot, or the swing arm pivot, we'll put those bolts in with red Loctite. Same thing with a lot of axles. Rear axles, we'll put those in, and then same thing with brake rotors and even sprockets in the rear. We'll put those 5 bolts into the hub with red Loctite. Now if you're using billet, that's really going to suck because it's probably not going to come out, so make sure you're using an acceptable material and metal on that one. And then mounting bolts, engine mounting bolts, transmission bolts, those would be something to red, but everything else is blue, and that'll be your go-to thing. So let me double check right here before we run out of time. Man, Dennis, you are working, man. With a stock carbon jacket, would like to upgrade the car. What car would you recommend for an upgrade? Notice a big difference in performance. All right, you've got a question is 98 Dyna Y Glide with a stock carb with jet kit, and would like to upgrade the carb. What carb would you recommend for an upgrade, and will I notice a big difference in performance? Two ends to your question. If you get the right setup with the right exhaust, you will notice a big performance increase. But check out some of the videos we have here on Fix My Hog with referencing the carburetors in different areas to look for. I don't want to steer you in the wrong direction and say go with this manufacturer or this one, but you can go with some of the main manufacturers and get another jet size, go to a stage 1 or stage 2, and work with that and do some fine tuning in the internals of the carburetor, meaning replacing some jets and some needles, and you can take that approach too. But keep in mind when you're upgrading your carburetor and you're taking in more air and more fuel that way, we want to kind of do that in tangent with the exhaust. And on a Dyna, you're not going to be worried about too much of a tuner, but you could add those kind of components in. So make sure you're working with that as well. I don't want to go further on that and steer you in the wrong direction. So, but you can always work with what you have and continue to work and get that tuned in and work on your timing as well. But there's some of the main manufacturers out there make some wicked carbs that you can just smack right on, and you'll definitely notice a horsepower and torque increase on that as well. So, well, guys, I think I've done enough talking for this month's live event, and obviously always a pleasure being here with you guys. Remember, if you got any more questions on what you should do on your pre-ride or continue to look forward down the road, send us an email, put it in the questions box. We'll get around to it. And thanks for tuning in for this month, and we'll see you next month. Is he gonna text you when the
Yeah. Wants me to zoom in.
fix my